When Dutch Schultz decided Harlem needed to be reminded who really owned New York, he didn't send a letter. He sent a message. It arrived just after midnight, carried on the nervous shoulders of a man who didn't belong in Harlem after dark. The messenger stood stiff inside Small's Paradise, hat clenched in his hands, eyes darting between the musicians packing up and the men lining the walls. Every face in the room knew why he was there, and every one of them knew who he was there for. Bumpy Johnson sat at his usual table, posture calm, expression unreadable. The room bent around him the way streets bent around a courthouse, not because of noise, but because of gravity. He didn't look up right away. He let the silence stretch. Let the messenger sweat. Let the weight of Harlem press down on a man who thought borrowed courage from a Bronx gangster would protect him. Finally, Bumpy raised his eyes. "Speak," he said softly. The messenger swallowed. "Mr. Schultz says Harlem's arrangement is over. Says you're to step aside. Says the numbers, the clubs, the streets, they belong to him now." No one moved. No one breathed. Dutch Schultz had just declared war on Harlem. And worse, he'd done it by trying to erase the one man everyone knew you did not erase. Bumpy Johnson leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as if considering a chess move already won. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Did he sign his name to that?" Bumpy asked. The messenger nodded. That was when the men along the wall understood something irreversible had just happened. Dutch Schultz hadn't challenged a business arrangement. He hadn't crossed a line. He had disrespected a legend. And Harlem never forgave that. Long before Dutch Schultz's name echoed through speakeasies and newspapers, before the Bronx bootlegger became a millionaire off blood and liquor, Harlem already had its own kingmaker. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson didn't rule with noise. He ruled with presence. He walked the streets of Harlem like they belonged to him because in every way that mattered, they did. Numbers runners tipped their hats when he passed. Club owners waited for his nod before making decisions. Even police captains, men who wore the law like armor, learned quickly that Harlem worked differently when Bumpy Johnson was involved. This was the early 1930s. Prohibition had turned New York City into a battlefield where money moved faster than bullets and loyalty was the only real currency. The mafia controlled downtown. Irish mobs carved up Hell's Kitchen. Jewish gangs ran the garment districts and parts of Brooklyn. And Harlem, vibrant, proud, dangerous, was supposed to be nothing more than territory to be exploited. But Bumpy Johnson made it something else. He was educated, sharply dressed, and terrifyingly calm. He quoted Shakespeare and negotiated like a diplomat. He believed power wasn't taken. It was demonstrated, and Harlem respected him not because he demanded it, but because he protected it. Bumpy didn't just run numbers. He enforced boundaries. White gangsters could make money in Harlem, but only with permission. Police could patrol, but not harass. Violence was allowed only when necessary, and even then, it came with rules. Harlem wasn't lawless. It was governed, and that governance made Bumpy Johnson dangerous to men like Dutch Schultz. Schultz was chaos wrapped in ambition. He believed intimidation solved everything. His empire was built on fear, executions, and public brutality meant to send a message. Where Bumpy cultivated loyalty, Schultz demanded submission. For years, Schultz stayed clear of Harlem, not out of respect, but calculation. The profits were good, but the resistance was unpredictable. and unpredictable men got people killed. But as the Depression tightened its grip and competition grew fiercer, Schultz grew restless. The mafia was squeezing him downtown. Rivals chipped away at his bootlegging roots. He needed new revenue. Harlem looked ripe. To Schultz, Bumpy Johnson was just another obstacle, a local boss, a negotiable problem. He didn't understand that Harlem wasn't run by fear. It was run by memory. Every man in those streets remembered the beatings, the raids, the crooked cops shaking down black businesses with impunity. They remembered being treated like expendable labor while outsiders took profits and left bodies behind. And they remembered that Bumpy Johnson stood in the middle of all that and said, "No." So when Dutch Schultz sent word that Harlem was over, it wasn't just a threat to Bumpy's income. It was a threat to Harlem's dignity. Bumpy knew that. He also knew something else. If he ignored Schultz, Harlem would see weakness. If he attacked blindly, Harlem would burn. The response had to be precise, measured, and unmistakable. Bumpy rose from his chair, straightened his jacket, and looked at the messenger, a man who would carry his words back into a lion's den. "Go tell Mr. Schultz," Bumpy said evenly, "that Harlem hears him." The messenger nodded, relieved. "And tell him this too," Bumpy continued, stepping closer, his voice low enough to feel like a warning carved in stone. "Harlem doesn't move aside. Harlem stands its ground." The messenger left quickly after that. Behind him, Harlem remained silent, but not calm. Because everyone knew what came next wouldn't be loud at first. It would be deliberate. And it would end with a lesson Dutch Schultz would never forget. Dutch Schultz laughed when the message reached him. Not the warm kind, not the kind that invited agreement. It was a sharp, cutting sound that filled the private back room of a Bronx roadhouse and made the men around the table shift uneasily. Schultz leaned back, fingers drumming against his glass, eyes gleaming with the confidence of a man who believed violence was the same thing as strength. "Harlem stands its ground," he repeated. "That what he said?" The messenger nodded. "Word for word." Schultz smirked. "Then Harlem's about to learn what happens when it stands in front of a train." This was how Dutch Schultz solved problems. He didn't negotiate unless he had to. He crushed resistance early and publicly, so others didn't get ideas. In his mind, Bumpy Johnson was already outdated. A relic clinging to power in a neighborhood Schultz believed would fold the moment real pressure arrived. But Schultz misread the board. Harlem wasn't afraid. It was watchful. Within days, the pressure began. Subtle at first, almost polite. Numbers runners were stopped and questioned by unfamiliar faces. Truck drivers bringing liquor north found routes blocked or delayed. Club owners received offers that sounded friendly but carried an unmistakable edge. Mr. Schultz would hate for anything to happen to this place. Bumpy watched it all unfold without reaction. He sat in meetings, listened to complaints, and said very little. That silence unsettled his men more than anger ever could. They expected retaliation. Instead, they saw patience. Because Bumpy Johnson understood something Schultz never did. Power moves fastest when it doesn't announce itself. Bumpy's first move wasn't violence. It was information. He sent men to listen, to observe, to learn which Schultz lieutenants were stepping into Harlem and who they answered to. He mapped the pressure like a general studying enemy supply lines. And while Schultz flexed, Bumpy waited. The real tension didn't erupt on the streets. It surfaced behind closed doors, in places where money talked louder than guns. A prominent Harlem club owner was summoned downtown for a business conversation. He returned shaken, speaking of veiled threats and smiling men who never smiled with their eyes. Word spread quickly. Schultz wasn't just testing Bumpy, he was testing Harlem's nerve. That was when the whispers started. Maybe Bumpy had gone soft. Maybe the times were changing. Maybe Harlem needed new leadership. Those whispers were more dangerous than any gun. Bumpy heard them. He didn't silence them. He let them circulate, knowing that doubt always revealed who could be trusted and who couldn't. Then came the first real insult. One of Schultz's men, drunk, arrogant, and eager to prove himself, assaulted a numbers runner in broad daylight near Lenox Avenue. He didn't just rob him. He humiliated him, left him bleeding in the street as a crowd gathered. The police arrived quickly, too quickly. They arrested the runner. The message was clear. Schultz had friends in the system, and he wasn't afraid to use them. That night, Harlem buzzed with anger. Men gathered in back rooms, voices rose, eyes burned. They wanted blood. Bumpy Johnson listened and shook his head. "Not yet," he said. Those two words carried more authority than any shouted command. Still, even his closest lieutenants struggled to understand. "How long we supposed to let this go on?" one asked. "Schultz thinks we're weak." Bumpy met his gaze, unblinking. "Schultz thinks loud men win quiet wars." He paused. "They don't." The next move came from Schultz again, bolder this time. A meeting request, neutral ground, downtown. It was a trap disguised as diplomacy. Schultz wanted Bumpy in his territory, on his terms, surrounded by his men. He wanted to look Bumpy in the eye and see fair, or manufacture it. Most men would have refused. Bumpy accepted. The meeting took place in a smoke-choked back room of a midtown restaurant. Schultz sat at the head of the table, flanked by muscle, his presence filling the space like poison gas. When Bumpy entered, the room went quiet. This was the first time the two men faced each other. Schultz studied him openly. The tailored suit, the calm eyes, the lack of nerves. This wasn't the defiant, street boss Schultz expected. "You're smaller than I imagined," Schultz said, smirking. Bumpy smiled faintly. "You're louder." The air tightened. Schultz leaned forward. "Here's how this works. You step aside. I run Harlem. You get a cut and live long enough to enjoy it." Bumpy didn't answer right away. He looked around the room, at the guns beneath jackets, the men pretending not to watch his hands. Then he spoke. "Harlem isn't for sale?" Schultz's smile vanished. "Everything's for sale." Bumpy shook his head. "Not dignity." That word landed hard. Schultz's face flushed. "You think you're untouchable?" Schultz snapped. "I erase men every day." Bumpy leaned in just enough for Schultz to hear him clearly. "You erase men who stand alone," he said. "I stand with a city." The meeting ended shortly after. No violence, no threats spoken out loud. But both men knew the line had been crossed. Schultz left, convinced force would break Harlem. Bumpy left, knowing the warning stage was over. What came next wouldn't be a negotiation. It would be an example. The first warning didn't come with blood. That was intentional. Dutch Schultz expected violence. He expected bodies, bullets, and retaliation loud enough to justify the war he wanted. What he didn't expect was silence. Calculated, unsettling silence that made his own men nervous. It started with a shipment. one of Schultz's most reliable liquor trucks, a convoy protected by armed escorts and police cooperation, vanished somewhere between New Jersey and the Bronx. No hijacking reports, no gunfire, no witnesses. The truck simply never arrived. Schultz raged. Accusations flew. Men swore loyalty while sweating through their suits. Then the truck reappeared. 3 days later, it was found parked neatly outside a Bronx warehouse Schultz used regularly. The doors were unlocked, the cargo untouched. On the driver's seat sat a single envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "You move through Harlem because we allow it. No signature." Schultz read it twice. Then he tore it in half and laughed. But his laughter didn't reach his eyes. "This is theater," he told his men. "He's bluffing." Bumpy Johnson wasn't bluffing. The next move targeted something Schultz valued more than liquor: reputation. A Schultz lieutenant, known for his brutality, a man who enjoyed humiliating people, was quietly exposed. Ledgers disappeared. Information surfaced. Word reached federal investigators about unpaid taxes, side deals, and violence Schultz himself had ordered but never personally touched. The pressure tightened. Schultz's circle began to shrink, not because of fear, but because of doubt. Men started asking whether Harlem was worth the trouble, whether Bumpy Johnson was more dangerous than he looked. That doubt infuriated Schultz. He decided to answer subtlety with spectacle. One night, a Harlem-owned club that refused Schultz's protection was firebombed after closing. No one was killed, but the message was unmistakable. This time, Bumpy Johnson didn't stay silent. He stood in the street the next morning, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the blackened remains of the building while the neighborhood gathered around him. He didn't speak to reporters. He didn't curse Schultz's name. He simply looked. That image traveled fast. Bumpy Johnson, standing calm amid destruction, absorbing the anger of an entire community. That night, he summoned his inner circle. "This ends now," he said. The plan was simple, surgical, and devastating. The confrontation wouldn't happen in Harlem. It would happen where Schultz felt safest. A high-stakes card game was scheduled, one Schultz attended regularly, surrounded by trusted men and protected by bribes and influence. Bumpy knew about it because power left footprints, and Schultz was careless. Bumpy didn't bring an army. He brought a message. When Schultz arrived that night, the room felt off. Familiar faces were missing. Conversations paused when he entered. Still, he sat down, confident in his reputation. Then Bumpy Johnson walked in. No weapon drawn, no entourage, just two men who stayed by the door. The room froze. Schultz stood halfway from his chair. "You've got nerve." Bumpy took a seat across from him without asking permission. "I came to finish our conversation," he said. Schultz sneered. "You picked the wrong place." Bumpy met his eyes. "No, I picked the right one." The cards stopped. Everyone listened. "You set fires in my neighborhood," Bumpy continued. "You embarrassed my people. You think that makes you powerful." Schultz's jaw tightened. "It makes me inevitable." Bumpy shook his head slowly. "It makes you careless." That was when the door opened again. Two men Schultz trusted were escorted out, unharmed, shaken, alive. The implication was chilling. Bumpy leaned in. "This is your warning," he said quietly. "No bodies, no blood, because I want you alive long enough to understand." Schultz's confidence cracked, just slightly. "You touch Harlem again," Bumpy continued, "and next time I don't send notes." The room held its breath. Schultz stared at him, rage battling realization. He wanted to explode, but power had shifted. For the first time, Schultz understood he wasn't dealing with a street tough. He was dealing with control. Bumpy stood. "We're done," he said, and he walked out. The aftermath was immediate. Schultz didn't retaliate. He couldn't. Not without exposing vulnerabilities he'd spent years hiding. The message had landed exactly as intended. Harlem breathed again. But Bumpy Johnson knew something Schultz didn't yet accept. Warnings only worked once. The next chapter wouldn't be subtle. It would be final. Dutch Schultz didn't sleep the night after the card game. He sat alone in his apartment, whiskey untouched, staring out the window as New York breathed below him. For the first time in years, the city felt unfamiliar, like a machine he no longer fully controlled. Bumpy Johnson hadn't threatened him with bullets. He hadn't embarrassed him in front of the papers. He'd done something far worse. He'd exposed him. Schultz's power had always depended on certainty. The belief that he was unstoppable, that his reach was longer and his violence more inevitable than anyone else's. But Bumpy Johnson had punctured that myth with precision. He'd shown Schultz that Harlem wasn't reckless. It was organized, watching, patient, and patience terrified men like Schultz. Within days, the consequences began to surface. Schultz's business partners started hesitating. Meetings were postponed. Phone calls went unanswered longer than usual. Even the cops who'd once smiled at him now seemed distracted, cautious about being too closely associated with a man who might be drawing federal attention. That attention wasn't accidental. Bumpy's people hadn't leaked rumors. They'd delivered facts. Clean, quiet, undeniable. Tax discrepancies, hidden accounts, names tied to Schultz's operations that suddenly appeared on the wrong desks. Schultz had always believed he was smarter than the law. Now the law was circling. In Harlem, the effect was immediate and visible. Numbers runners returned to their roots without interference. Clubs reopened with quiet confidence. The whispers stopped, replaced by something heavier and more permanent. Respect. Men who had doubted Bumpy now lowered their eyes when he passed. Not out of fear, but understanding. He hadn't rushed. He hadn't reacted emotionally. He'd waited until the right moment and struck where it mattered most. One club owner said it plainly. He didn't fight Schultz. He corrected him. That correction echoed beyond Harlem. Other gangs noticed, quietly, carefully. They saw that Schultz, once known for public executions and loud domination, had backed off without a shot fired. That didn't happen unless something fundamental had shifted. Schultz felt it too. He ordered his men to pull back from Harlem operations. Not publicly, never that. The narrative was framed as temporary restructuring, but everyone knew the truth. Harlem was no longer worth the cost, and the cost kept rising. Federal scrutiny intensified. Schultz's temper, always volatile, began working against him. He lashed out at subordinates, made enemies faster than he could silence them. The same brutality that once built his empire now destabilized it. Bumpy Johnson watched from a distance. He didn't gloat. He didn't pursue Schultz further. That restraint confused outsiders, but Harlem understood. The lesson had been delivered. Pressing further would have turned justice into cruelty. Bumpy wasn't interested in humiliation. He was interested in balance. One evening, weeks after the confrontation, Bumpy sat with trusted elders in Harlem. Businessmen, clergy, quiet power brokers who rarely spoke publicly but carried influence. One of them asked, "Is it finished?" Bumpy considered the question. "With Schultz?" he said. "Yes." "With men like him?" another asked. Bumpy smiled faintly. "Men like him come and go. Harlem stays." That answer carried weight, because not long after, Dutch Schultz's world collapsed entirely, not because of Bumpy Johnson directly, but because once the illusion of invincibility cracked, everything else followed. Enemies multiplied, allies vanished, law enforcement closed in. When Schultz was finally gunned down months later, betrayed, hunted, desperate, Harlem didn't celebrate. They remembered. They remembered the night Bumpy Johnson chose restraint over chaos. The moment he proved power didn't need spectacle. That dignity could stand up to terror and win. And in Harlem, Bumpy's reputation transformed from feared leader to something rarer, a protector. Time did what violence could not. It clarified. As years passed, the story of Dutch Schultz's failed push into Harlem became something more than a cautionary tale. It became a benchmark. Other gangsters whispered about it in back rooms. Young hustlers heard it secondhand. Stripped of names at first, then slowly reattached as truth hardened into legend. They all learned the same lesson. Harlem was different. And that difference had a name. Bumpy Johnson didn't expand his territory after Schultz fell. He didn't seize new districts or overplay his hand. Instead, he reinforced what already existed. A network built on understanding, restraint, and mutual respect. That was the source of his power. Harlem prospered in its own way. Clubs thrived. Numbers, money circulated through local hands. Police interference softened, not out of fear, but recognition. Officers learned that chaos never benefited them in Harlem. Order did. And order was Bumpy Johnson's currency. Older residents remembered what it was like before him, when outsiders treated the neighborhood like an open vault, when brutality replaced conversation. Younger generations grew up assuming Harlem had rules, unaware that those rules had once been fought for quietly, deliberately, by a man who refused to be erased. Bumpy's legend spread beyond Harlem because it contradicted expectations. He didn't fit the stereotype. He wasn't loud. He wasn't reckless. He read poetry. He dressed with elegance. He spoke softly and acted decisively. That combination unsettled rivals more than rage ever could. Historians would later debate the extent of his influence. How much was myth? How much documented fact? But in Harlem, those debates didn't matter. They knew what they'd seen. They'd seen a man stand up to one of the most violent gangsters in America and win without turning his streets into a graveyard. They'd seen restraint become a weapon more effective than fear. And they understood the price of that restraint. Bumpy Johnson had carried the weight of the community's expectations. He'd absorbed pressure meant for others. He'd chosen calculated silence when reaction would have been easier. That was leadership. Years later, when younger men asked how Harlem stayed free when others fell, the answer was always the same. Because someone stood when it mattered. The Schultz episode became a reference point, not for violence, but for boundaries. It taught Harlem that respect could be enforced without surrendering dignity. That survival didn't require imitation of the very forces that sought to dominate. Bumpy Johnson remained a controversial figure. He was never a saint. But in a time when black neighborhoods were routinely exploited, erased, or crushed under outside control, He represented something rare: autonomy. When Bumpy eventually aged out of power, the systems he'd built endured longer than most expected. Not forever. Nothing lasts forever, but long enough to leave an imprint. That imprint lived in the way Harlem negotiated with the outside world, in the way men carried themselves, in the expectation that respect was not optional. Dutch Schultz had tried to erase Bumpy Johnson. Instead, he'd carved his name deeper into history. This wasn't just a story about two gangsters colliding in a violent era. It was a story about power, and the difference between taking it and earning it. Dutch Schultz believed domination was permanent. That fear could outlast memory. That if he was loud enough, brutal enough, relentless enough, the world would eventually move aside. Men like him always believed that, and history always proves them wrong. Bumpy Johnson understood something deeper. He knew power rooted in chaos collapses under its own weight. He knew respect, once earned, outlives violence. And he knew that a community protected with discipline would stand firmer than one ruled by terror. When Schultz tried to erase him, Bumpy didn't answer with spectacle. He answered with precision, with restraint, with a warning that carried the full weight of Harlem behind it. That moment mattered because it drew a line, not just for one man, but for an entire neighborhood that had been told its dignity was negotiable. It wasn't. Harlem didn't need a savior. It needed a guardian. Someone willing to stand in the quiet spaces where real power lives, between chaos and order, fear and respect. That's what made Bumpy Johnson a legend. Not the money, not the reputation, but the choice to protect instead of destroy. Because sometimes the most powerful response isn't revenge. It's standing your ground and reminding the world that respect has consequences. And that is why, long after Dutch Schultz faded into history as another cautionary name, Bumpy Johnson's story remained, untold to some, but never forgotten by the streets that watched him stand.